All right, so our next chapter is all about acids and bases, and we've actually seen a fair amount of acids and bases in our last lab, or I guess 2 labs ago, where we used that cabbage indicator. So let's come up with a generic list for characteristics that make something acidic versus basic. And let's start out with foods. So an acidic food, does anybody have an example of one? What do you think? Oranges, right? So oranges have something called citric acid in it, so that's acidic. And typically we think of citrus fruits as being kind of sour. So kind of the things that make you pucker, like lemons, limes, oranges. Bases, on the other hand, are typically things that are quite bitter, not sour. They have a very astringent quality to them. The other thing too is with acids, if you remember in lab, you treated it with litmus paper and it turned blue litmus paper red. Where the opposite is true for bases, they turn red paper blue. So if you do have access to litmus paper, you can check really quick whether or not something's acidic or basic. There's a couple other qualities with acids. They can react with something called an active metal. To make hydrogen gas. So if you remember going all the way back to our iron and sulfur lab, when you added HCl to the iron, it started bubbling a little bit. That's one of those active metals. All right? With bases, they don't tend to do that. However, they can react with acids. And you saw this in the carbonates lab. And in the carbonate lab, what were the byproducts of the reaction? There was CO2. What was the other thing we made? Water. So it reacts with acid to make water. And typically a salt. A salt can be really anything that's ionic, not just sodium chloride. All right, on the other side, acids can react with bases. To make water and salt. And I'm going to put salt in quotes just to imply that it's not always going to be sodium chloride. The other thing too is there's various strengths of acids and bases. Typically you can determine if something's basic by touching it too. So if you dip your finger in a base, your fingers feel kind of slimy afterwards. Bases will often react with your skin and make them feel a little weird. Yep?
So what would be a common base then?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a few. There's a lot of alkaloids that are incredibly bitter in cooking. I'm trying to think of a non-cocktail example, but a lot of them are found in cocktails. Yeah, so baking soda is a classic household base. We'll take a look at a few household bases. Yeah, but typically bases will feel slimy if you get them on your skin. All right, so here's some example of some household acids and bases. If you look at the ones on the left versus the ones on the right, which one do you think are the acids? Yeah, the ones on the left are our acids. Right, we said citrus fruits like limes and oranges are acids. A lot of you checked aspirin in lab too. Aspirin is acidic. Vinegar is definitely acidic, and vitamin C is also acidic. If we look at the bases over here, I saw on many of your reports that you said bases are often found in cleaning products. That's true. So a lot of drain removers, things like that, are bases. as well as antacids. So things like Tums and Pepto-Bismol oftentimes are basic as well. That way they neutralize your stomach acid. So there's a lot of them. Like I said before, if you ever are at home and you do want to check something, it's kind of fun to do that cabbage indicator thing, especially if you want to get some family members involved, like the little kids or even adults for that matter, and see if they can help you out with it. So like I said before, that bases will turn red paper blue. So bases turn red to blue. And the way I always remember this is that the B's match, right? So bases turn things blue. Acids, on the other hand, will turn blue paper red. Unfortunately, there's not a good trick for remembering acids, but they're just the opposite of how bases react with litmus paper. Yep? No, just litmus paper. So litmus paper is a special type of paper. It's really cheap, so you can buy it to have in your house as well. It's a good question. There's dyes embedded in it that will react under certain pH ranges, and they actually change colors. Yep. How many of you are familiar with this type of flower? Does anybody remember the name? Hydrangeas. I'm not sure if I'll spell this right, but I'll give it the old college try. Something like that? I'm not sure. I'm not a gardener. But hydrangeas are pretty popular flowers in the Northwest. And if you look around, you'll see blue ones and red ones pretty commonly. And one thing I didn't know until I started teaching this class was it depends what soil they're grown in. The blue ones are found in acidic soil. Typically, if you plant hydrangeas near pine trees, for example, the needles will drop, make the soil a little bit acidic, and actually change the colors of the hydrangeas to blue. And then if you want the pink ones, you can do the opposite. You can have basic soil. So for example, if you grow this in an area with a lot of limestone around, limestone is basic, it'll turn your hydrangeas pink. So kind of a unique example in nature. We also saw that cabbage indicators can change color. If you remember, the middle here was about neutral. What about the pink ones? Was that acidic or basic? Acidic. And over here, towards the green side, we had basic. And so you can use this at home to really quickly tell if something's acidic or basic. Does anybody remember the compound that's responsible for this? I didn't put it on the pre-lab quiz. It's a long name. It's anthocyanins. So if you go on and take more and more chemistry, you'll actually learn about why the color change occurs. But it's pretty interesting. All right, so now we've got to define acids and bases beyond just these color changes and talk about their chemical properties. So we got to step back in time a bit and talk about the different definitions as they evolved. The first one that was really pushed was called the Arrhenius Definition. And this definition said that acids produce protons and bases produce hydroxide. So that was one of our main polyatomic ions, but hydroxide is very common for bases. So let's take a look at a few examples. And I think this was on your pod as well. Let's say we have HCl. This is hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid, being an acid, really wants to give up a proton. So it's going to generate H+ in solution. And then what's going to be left over if it loses H+? You're going to have Cl, but will it be positive or minus? Would have to be minus, right, to cancel out the charges. We can't just create charges. So we get a proton and we get a chloride anion out. Let's do another one. Let's say we have HNO3. This is nitric acid. Again, we would get H+, and what would our anion be? NO3 with what charge? It'd have to be -1, right, to counteract the proton, which was positive. What was the name of this polyatomic ion again? Nitrate. So we've got a nitrate anion here. All right, let's do the same thing with bases really quick. All right, let's say we've got sodium hydroxide. That's one of our classic bases. We know it's a base, so we're going to get OH- out. And what's going to be left over this time? Sodium. And sodium must have a positive charge to counteract that negative charge from the hydroxide. Same thing, let's say we've got magnesium hydroxide. This one's a little bit more challenging. We are still going to produce hydroxide, but how many of them are we going to produce? 2 of them, right? We've got this 2 in the subscript outside of our parentheses. That means it's going to be our prefix now. It's going to say we're going to get 2 hydroxides, and we're going to get magnesium, which has what charge? +2. It's in group 2A, so we know it'd be 2+. So this was the definition that stood for a long time, and there's a bunch of common acids that tend to follow this. So I'll show you this. You can find this in your book. I just wanted to show you a lot of them and how they relate to your day-to-day life. The first one's sulfuric acid, H2SO4. It's a really, really, really strong acid. In fact, it's kind of our gold standard of acids. If you've ever lifted a car batteries are lead acid batteries. They've got sulfuric acid in them as well as lead. Sulfuric acid's used a lot in the chemical industry as well, just because it's an incredibly strong acid. Hydrochloric acid, you may actually have some of this in your house. It can be found in cleaning supplies. It's also inside your stomach. Your gastric juices are hydrochloric acid. It helps break down food. And then the next one that we see here is phosphoric acid. Phosphoric acid, believe it or not, is actually found in most colas. So if you have Coke, things like that, they have a little bit of phosphoric acid in there. It's a moderate acid. We don't want to drink a super strong acid most of the time. And one trick you can do is if you ever have something that's rusty, you can actually soak it in Coke and it will remove the rust. If you also want to freak your kids out, you can take their teeth after they lose a tooth and put it in Coke and then watch their tooth slowly dissolve and be like, this is why you shouldn't drink as much soda. Next one is lactic acid. Lactic acid is found in yogurt. It's the thing that gives yogurt that kind of tart flavor. It's also found in your muscles when you work out a lot. So how many of you have gone on a long run and felt that burning sensation? Yeah, that's lactic acid building up in your muscles. So it's a biological chemical as well. Acetic acids, the next one down, that's found in vinegar. So vinegar's formal name is acetic acid. The next one we have is boric acid. Boric acid is found in ant poison and roach poison. It's also commonly used for cleaning, so people will use it as a laundry detergent. Hydrocyanic acid is incredibly toxic. If you've ever watched spy movies where they have that pill that they clamp down on and then start foaming at the mouth and commit suicide, that's a cyanide pill. Not the most pleasant way to go. If you get poisoned with cyanide, essentially what happens is you suffocate. Your oxygen or your blood cells are no longer able to bind to oxygen, and you basically will just suffocate. It's an awful way to go. All right, moving on to non-morbid things. Let's move on to bases. First one, we've got sodium hydroxide. Sodium hydroxide and potassium hydroxide are both used in soap making. We're actually, I think, going to make soap for our last lab. Soap making is really fun and something you can do at home. Lithium hydroxide is used in a lot of batteries. It's not used very often for soap making, though. Calcium hydroxide is not very soluble. It's used typically in things like cement or plastering. Magnesium hydroxide is typically found in laxatives or antacids. So most hydroxides can be used as an antacid, but magnesium hydroxide is the most gentle. And then ammonia is used as a household cleaner. So if you've ever used Windex, Windex has ammonia in it. It's also used in fertilizers as well. So there's a lot of them around. The key is, if you look at most of these bases, see how we've got OH, 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 OH. All of these are going to be bases because they're producing hydroxide. The thing that really messed up the whole Arrhenius theory was ammonia. If we put ammonia into water, it can't give up hydroxide, but it behaves like a base. So what they had to do is they actually had to develop a new theory to explain things like ammonia and explain why ammonia acts as a base. And so two chemists came together and came up with a theory. The chemists were Bronsted and Lowry. And they basically said it's not necessarily the hydroxide that makes something basic. It has more to do with which directions protons are being moved. So they realized that there was a problem. Not all bases produce hydroxide. And the example that they looked at was ammonia. And then the other problem that people realized later was that protons, H+, don't exist in solution. So a proton's a subatomic particle. It doesn't really just want to float around freely in solution. It's very, very reactive. It wants to find something to react with. So they came up with a newer, better definition. And the new definition is pretty good for most acids and bases, and it said that acids are something that donate protons. And I'll kind of describe what I mean by that, because like I said, protons don't exist in solution. Essentially, protons get handed off in solution. And then bases, on the other hand, they receive protons. And the way I like describing this is using a track analogy. How many of you have participated in track? I'm assuming most people have seen relay races before, where you have a baton and you hand it off to the next runner. I like to imagine it as a relay race. The proton is handed off. Between the acid and the base. Almost like a track baton. All right, so I'll show you some common ways of showing this handoff of protons. And this does get a little bit advanced, so hang in there with me. So let's say we have ammonia, which is NH3. We have HCl, hydrochloric acid. We know that's an acid. So let's quickly label our base and our acid over here. We know that acids want to give up their proton, and the base wants to grab that proton. So I imagine the acid as the front runner, kind of ahead, and the base is going to catch up behind it and catch that proton. So what's going to happen is this lone pair is actually going to reach over, grab this proton, and then the chlorine's just going to take its hand back. So when you do this, whoops, we often show this handoff using this arrow notation like I've shown. So the nitrogen's reaching out, grabbing that proton from the acid. Now the nitrogen has a proton bound to it in addition to its 3 regular hydrogens. What charge do you think it will have if it picked up a H+? Positive charge, exactly. So if you gain a proton, you're going to get a positive charge. Conversely, over here, this chlorine originally had 6 lone pairs around it. Now it has all 8. This chlorine, in order to balance things out, must have a negative charge. Does that make sense? Sorry, I like the relay analogy. Let's do a few more, though. The next one, we'll do sodium hydroxide. Is sodium hydroxide, NaOH, covalent or ionic? And how would we draw it? Raise your hand if you think it's ionic. Yeah, it's got a metal in there. So we know sodium is going to be positive. Hydroxide, on the other hand, is a polyatomic ion. And the oxygen is negative. So this is our base. And then if you react sodium hydroxide with water, water must be our acid. You always have to have this complementary pairing. Only one thing can be the base, and then the other thing must be the acid. Okay, so the base, just like up above, is going to try to steal a proton from the acid. So it's going to reach over here, grab this proton, and then give electrons that were in that bond back to the oxygen. All right, so now we've got sodium. Sodium's just floating around. We often call this a spectator ion because it's just not participating. It's just observing the reaction taking place. And then what we end up having is the hydroxide now has a new bond with it. Should it have a charge now? So this unit right here, after it steals the proton over here, will it have a charge? No, it had a negative charge, it took a positive, now it's neutral. And then the water that was over here, I'll just circle this in blue, is now going to be switched to hydroxide. So sometimes you have a reaction where it actually produces the same as what you put in, but you can have this handing off of protons like we saw in the ammonia and hydrochloric acid example. All right, let's try another one. And I want you to help me with the arrows, so I'll give you a minute to think about this. First thing you should do is determine which one's the acid and the base, and then show the arrows to show a handoff of your proton and the anticipated products. If you think you got it, you give me a thumbs up too. You can also check with your neighbor and make sure you have the right charges as well. All right, who thinks they know what the acid is? let's think about this. HCl, we just said was hydrochloric acid. By its very name, we know it must be an acid. It's a little bit tricky. So let's take a look at this. And this time, HCl is going to be our acid, and water is going to be our base. Students will look at this, though, and they'll say, but up here, water was acting as an acid, but down below, it's acting as a base. Why? If you remember in our acid-base lab, we said that neutral water is pH 7. It doesn't really have a strong preference towards being an acid or a base. So it can actually do either. It can either steal protons or donate protons. Okay, so now we've got our acid and our base. Our base, if you remember, wants to steal a proton from the acid. So it's going to reach over, grab the proton from the acid, and then kick electrons over to the chlorine. All right, so now the chlorine, has all of its electrons, and what charge should it have if it lost its proton? Should be negative. And then over here, the water got an extra proton, so it will be positive. This is a unique molecule, or ion, I should say. This is the hydronium ion. Where up here we've got the hydroxide anion. So if you remember before, we said in the Arrhenius theory that acids produce H+. In reality, in aqueous conditions, we're not producing H+, we're producing hydronium ions. Under basic conditions, we're oftentimes producing hydroxide ions. So that theory is partially right, but not entirely right. Does that make sense? Let's make a note that water can act as an acid or a base. It doesn't really have a strong preference in either direction. Make sense? All right. Let's jump into strong acids and bases next. Yep.
You spelled one on the bottom one, you wrote the dash between the H and the O, and then the one above, they were kind of right next to each other.
Oh, so yeah, with the hydroxide ion, one thing I could have done was written it out like that. It's okay to draw it either way.
There's no difference.
Yeah, there's no difference. If you don't show that dash, it's an implied single bond. Yeah. Good point. All right, so let's jump into strong acids and bases and determine what makes them different from weak acids and bases. Oops, that's not a good W. And the general idea is that strong acids completely dissociate. Acids or bases, I should say. And I'll show you what I mean by that with an example. So let's say we've got HCl plus water. If you mix these two together, like we saw before, you're going to get H3O plus. What was that called again? Hydronium ion. So that's a good term to know, especially if you go on in biology. And then we get the chloride anion. I'm not going to show the lone pairs this time, though. So the main thing to remember with this is you get 100% ions in solution. Another way of thinking about this is a one-way road. Once you go down that road, you're not going backwards, right? There are some reactions where you do go a little bit forwards, a little bit backwards, a little bit forwards, a little bit backwards. So let's talk about that next. And this occurs with weak acids. Okay, so let's see this as an example. An example weak acid we saw in the chart was HCN. And if you mix HCN plus water, what you're going to get is still a little bit of the hydronium ion. And you'll get a little bit of your cyanide anion. This time, though, it doesn't really want to form the products. And so what we do oftentimes as chemists is we show a little itty-bitty single-headed arrow like that, and then a big single-headed arrow pointed the other direction. And what this basically indicates is that it prefers to stay as starting materials. These arrows have a unique name. These are called equilibrium arrows. And they are like a two-way road. Meaning you can go forwards or backwards in this reaction. You're dynamically changing between starting materials and products, but it would prefer to stay as starting materials. So in this case, we're getting very little hydronium in solution. I'm going to abbreviate solution, SOLN, after being mixed. Does that make sense? Yep.
Does that mean that like only some of them are reactive? Is that why
Yeah, so if we think about mixing HCN and water, you're going to get this big hodgepodge of a mixture. But this side, the starting material side, will probably be, let's say, 90% present in solution. You might have 10% of what's shown on the right-hand side, and they're constantly switching back and forth. But the average is 90% starting material, 10% what's shown on the right-hand side.
If it prefers to stay starting material, why is the material?
That's a good point. So really what it is the statistical game. It's saying not all of it's going to react, but statistically, a tiny portion of it will. And so it's just statistics, essentially. That's a great question. All right, let's make a note too, and then I might let you out early. And this note is important. Acid strength does not equal concentration. And this is something a lot of people mess up. They think that an acid's strength is somehow related to how concentrated it is. So maybe something at a higher molarity will be a stronger acid or base. That's not necessarily true. Acid strength is an intrinsic property. And what we'll do later is we'll talk more about concentrations. We already saw this in class once as molarity, and then we saw it in lab as pH. pH and molarity can be related to one another, and we'll get into that math next week. All right, so that's where we're going to stop today. If you have any questions about your exam or feel like I should regrade one of the problems or even the whole thing, let me know.